project in Photoshop, so it stands to reason that we're going to be working in a Photoshop document. And this is going to be the master file that we use and that you're going to need to supply to me at the end, along with your final compressed outputs, so that I can see your original. Make sure that you set everything up the way that it's supposed to be set up. So, why would we use a Photoshop document? So, it does in fact support most of the image options that we want and are going to need when working in Photoshop. And there are certain things that a Photoshop document can handle that some of the other file formats can't. So this is one of the reasons that we're going to want to work in a PSD. It supports transparency, so that means that you can have a layer that, for example, you're going to bring in your Rex logo and you want it to sit on top of a photograph. Well, that Rex logo isn't going to have a background. It's going to have a transparent background, so you can put things on top of each other and you'll be able to see through them. It allows you to bring in text and have it stay as text itself, not to rasterize it. Again, at the very end, when you output in a different format, it will rasterize it, commit it into particular pixels, but until then you can work with your text natively and be able to make it as big or small. So it's kind of like it works with text as a vector inside of a pixel-based program. A little bit of best of both worlds. It can support something called an alpha channel. Now, you might have run into alpha channels when you're doing video production. Alpha channels are another method of getting transparency. And again, this is something that not all of our file types are going to support. It supports spot colors and duotones. So as I was talking about in terms of color modes, it would allow you to specify to a printer a very specific Pantone color or any other color system that you happen to be using that the printer will then reference and use. So you know that the ink used is the exact ink that you want it to be. And it allows you to also make or simulate, in the case that I showed you, what something would look like if you were printing it with just those two types of ink. It allows you to do clipping paths, which we're not going to get into, but you might get into if you were taking photography. The same with masks. These are different ways that you kind of create these kind of layers within Photoshop that trim or that do different things to the image in order to either edit it, enhance it, or work with it in a way so that when you bring in other elements, they intersect in various ways. Kind of the advanced options. Another reason that we're going to work in Photoshop files, Photoshop documents, is that it's not compressed. It stores every piece of information when you save. It doesn't get rid of any of it, and that's really important, especially when you're doing very fine photo editing. So it's a good choice for making your master document. We want all of our source images that we bring in to be as high quality as possible. So again, if you're going to be working in a format that's uncompressed, that's high resolution, you don't want to then bring in images from outside. Like if you were to look up some stock photography online, you wouldn't want to then bring in something that is low quality. So remember that when you're sourcing images to put inside your document. Because again, if you put something in your document and it is small, you're not going to blow it up. So whenever possible, please bring into your Photoshop document images that are uncompressed or as lossless as you can. Sometimes we can't control it. Sometimes, again, you're getting your images from a royalty-free and fee-free place, like someplace like Unsplash or Creative Commons, and you don't really have all that much control over what the original person has posted it in. It's probably going to be a JPEG. Okay, it is what it is. Hopefully it's a very large image so that you can bring it in at the size that you need. Other times, if you're buying the image, especially from a stock photo company, again, royalty-free, but in this case you're paying a fee, you can often specify the format and size. You often have to pay more for a larger file. But in that case, you know the size you need, and you can pay for the size that you need, and you can pay for it to be in an uncompressed format, like the next one we're going to talk about, TIFF. So there's only so much you can do with a low quality image to make it look good, because again, you can never recover the data that's been lost. So remember, when you're making this master file that you're going to work with, your output's only going to be as good as your inputs. So please, if you're going through the effort, you're going through the bother of doing all this, use high quality inputs so your output looks good in the end. Now, another really key aspect of a Photoshop document, and it kind of speaks to some of the stuff that I've just mentioned in terms of transparency, it supports layers. And that's huge. Most of what we're going to be doing is going to be manipulating different layers and looking at how those layers interact with each other, they intersect with each other, they influence each other. And layers are kind of key to what makes Photoshop so great. So you're going to want to make sure that you're working in a format that allows you to save those layers. If you went and you did all this work to place things, or change the way that the transparency is, or change the blending mode, we'll get into that when we talk about how we're going to use Photoshop, then you found out you want to change something, you don't want to have to start from scratch. So by preserving all these layers as they are, and again, all the data that goes with them, it allows us to make changes later and not have to redo our work. It's absolutely wonderful and really key and important. It does have some constraints though, so I just want to mention that most of what you're going to do, certainly everything you're going to do in my class, you can use a Photoshop file for, but occasionally you're going to work on something and it's going to give you an error message because it's too big. I have definitely worked on projects, especially ones that are photorealistic and that are like very large, like physically large. The file ends up being bigger than 2 gigabytes. Now, I mean, this does take some work. Not that you have to try, but if you are working on something that is physically massive, like a large banner that has a lot of photos and that has a lot of layers in it, you might end up with something that's larger than that. So then you have to use what's called a Photoshop Big, that's PSB. If you manage to make something bigger than 4 exabytes, please let me know, because that is like truly impressive. I think you have to like be making something that is for like the size of a building. And not that I don't know people who have made things that have gone on the sides of buildings, but yeah, you'd have to try pretty hard. So if you do run into an error message saying your file is too big to be saved as a Photoshop document, there is another option. So that's what we're going to be using most of the time. And that's what your master file is going to be in. But then I just want to mention 2 other file formats that you might be bringing in to your Photoshop file. The first one is a TIFF, and I just mentioned it a minute ago when I was talking about bringing in images from a stock photo site. So if you're buying photographs from a professional stock photo site, they'll come in different formats. And JPEG's great if you're using it on screen. But if you're going to be printing, you will often have the option of buying a TIFF. When possible, buy the TIFF. So TIFF, you don't need to know what it stands for, but if you're curious, it stands for Tagged Image File Format. Just know it's a TIFF. It is the standard, has been the standard for decades in terms of graphic design, because of the fact that it is it's program independent, so you don't have to have a PC, have a Mac, you don't have to have Photoshop, anything can open a TIFF, but importantly, it allows you to have either uncompressed, you can have a TIFF that has no compression at all, or lossless compression. And so again, if you are professionally working, with a printer and you're going to be having something mass produced, you don't want there to be data loss. So it's really good in that case to use them. They also do support layers, although, oh my God, those files get really big. But again, it does support it in a way that other programs don't. So it's really good if you need to deliver a lossless image file. And it means that you can, in fact, edit and resave your image without losing any data. The downside, as I just mentioned, is that they're huge. So Adobe Photoshop, Adobe has figured out a way to take that same data and store it a lot smaller. But that's a proprietary file format. That means that in order to open a Photoshop file, you need Photoshop, or you need another program that has paid a license to Adobe to allow you to open it. So a lot of files, a lot of programs will not open Photoshop documents because they don't want to pay Adobe that license. Everyone can open a TIFF. So Adobe basically, in order to get the bonus of being able to have small files, you have to pay Adobe. That's fine in our case, we have paid Adobe. But the reason that you might be supplying a printer or another designer or a client with a TIFF is if they don't have Photoshop, or they want to make sure that they can always open it whether or not they have Photoshop. So bigger file, but it's not tied to Adobe. It does offer a compression, so as I said, it can be uncompressed or compression, or have compression, and that compression is again lossless. It's like a zip file. All the data is still there. It's still gonna be bigger than a Photoshop file, even with compression, but it's not quite as big as an uncompressed TIFF. So if you are getting source images off of the web, if you have the option of getting a TIFF, get a TIFF. It hasn't lost any print data, and that's really important, especially if you're making something like a poster that you want to print out. You can scan images in if you have a scanner. If you scan images and you, again, unless you know you are only using that image forever and ever on screen, scan it in as a TIFF. Again, if you're taking photos and your camera allows you to change it from a JPEG to another format, your options are usually either TIFF or RAW. RAW is the best, and if you can't get RAW, get TIFF. So TIFF is kind of like your general non-dependent on Adobe best option for not losing any data. And as I just mentioned, RAW files, just want to touch on them because especially for those of you guys who are photographers or who take photography, you've probably run into RAW files. So it's the raw data from the camera that hasn't been processed in any way. So a lot of your professional digital cameras will allow you to shoot in RAW. And if you can, shoot in RAW. They're not processed. So that also means that they are not ready to be printed. And they're not ready to be edited with a bitmap graphics editor like Photoshop. Except for the fact that Adobe owns just about every image editing product on the planet. So where Adobe can use Illustrator files, it can have its text sit in as vector graphics until you want to print them out. In the same way, it has some of the capabilities of Lightroom built into itself. So in Photoshop, you can actually import in raw photo files. So again, you have to go through an import process because it needs to convert it, but it does have that conversion capability because they own Lightroom. So they can do that. Most other bitmap editors don't also own a raw editing program, so they can't. You'd have to bring it into something like Lightroom first. Lightroom is the name of Adobe's photo processing software. So again, you can use the controls that are in Lightroom if you want to be doing some stuff to the photographs before. And again, there's actually a way where you can work back and forth between Lightroom and Photoshop seamlessly because, of course, Adobe wants to make that really easy. So for photographs, when possible, take your photographs as RAWs. If that's not possible, TIFFs. As a last resort, JPEGs. Similarly, if you are getting an image from a stock photo site, if you can get it as a TIFF, get it as a TIFF. If you can't, fine, take it as a JPEG. Always get the largest file you can because, again, you can always make things smaller. You cannot make things bigger. So as a review for the master files, it's best practice to make a master lossless file which you then use to produce all your other copies from. And you're going to use that as the file you edit in. For our purposes, we're going to use Photoshop files, PSD files. There are times, again, if you are not working within a computer environment that has Adobe products, or if you're outputting to someone who does not have Adobe products, then you're going to use TIFFs. So Photoshop documents, not compressed, but relatively small for what they do. They support layers, which is super important, as well as supporting all of the other various things that Photoshop can do. TIFF files are going to be great for making sure you don't lose data, but they're larger files, but they are what is the professional standard, especially if you are kind of going between, if you're giving it to somebody else and you're not sure whether or not they're going to have Photoshop. You can compress them and have it be a lossless compression, but they're always going to be larger than the equivalent in a Photoshop document. RAW is going to be straight from your camera. When possible, shoot in RAW because you are going to lose as little data as possible. And then either import it to Photoshop or use Lightroom if you want to do some editing before you bring it into Photoshop. If you can't shoot in RAW, shoot in TIFF. And then as a last resort, use JPEG.